Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our pre-launch of Ulrich Obrist China Interviews book. My name is Philip Tinari, curator and critic based in Beijing. I'm also the director of a thing called the Office for Discourse Engineering, which is a very small publishing imprint out of Beijing focused on kind of books based on research into contemporary art in China these past 30 years. This is the man who needs no introduction, Ulrich Obrist, who among his many millions of other involvements has been an incredibly avid observer of the scene in China for about 15 years now. And as we wait for our finished design to arrive from Shenzhen, which is being downloaded at the moment and will arrive 10 minutes into the presentation, we're going to have a conversation kind of about Ulrich's work in China over the last 15 years, because it's something that he's never actually really spoken about publicly. And it's part of the impetus for this book, which collects interviews with 26 artists and architects from China that have been conducted in the years since 1997. So it's really going quite far back into history. One problem with the contemporary art scene in China is it seems to always be looking at its present and into its future, but we are almost ignorant of a now considerable past. And so this, in Ulrich's key phrase, is in some ways a protest against forgetting. It is a recording of conversations that have happened at specific moments which are becoming historical as the story kind of moves on. And it's volume 1 of what should be an ongoing series as these conversations continue. So I think a good place to start might actually be with Cities on the Move and the research that you made there with Ho Han-ru in 1996. And just to know a little bit about the milieu as you entered it and kind of how you encountered it and how it encountered you at that point in your career, and in the scene and its sort of development.
Yeah, it's interesting because, Cities on the Move was really this idea of an exhibition Ho Han-ru and I had for a long time. It took us quite some time until we find the right context to produce it. We met at the very beginning of the 90s. I had a grant at the Cartier Foundation. And the Cartier Foundation at that time wasn't in the city of Paris. They were on the outskirts. And they invited 4 or 5 artists for 2-month residencies. Jean de Loisy and Marie-Claude Beau were in charge of that at the time. And so I had these curator residencies. And on my left-hand side, we were living in little houses. On my left-hand side, there was Huang Yongping, the legendary Chinese artist who had just escaped from the Tiananmen disaster and had searched refuge in France, where he came for the first time for Magicien de la Terre, I think, and for a show also Fei Davi had done in Pourrières. And he, like many other artists from China, had actually, left China after '89, and they all went to Paris. Some went to New York, but many went to Paris. And so it was actually through this, living really with Huang Yongping and his wife for 2 months, and cooking and talking every day, and not really having a language, so mostly which we shared because they didn't speak any English nor French. I didn't speak any Chinese, so we had a kind of a communication a lot with drawings. We drew a lot of sketches, and it became the beginning of a dialogue. And then at the same time I met obviously Yan Pei-ming. I met the late Chen Zhen, the great Chinese artist who sadly died a couple of years ago. Ho Han-ru and Fei Davi, the curators who both had also arrived in Paris. So it was an incredible, it was almost like an art world within the art world. Here we are in Paris, and it felt interesting because somehow my whole background had really been Western art, and I realized at the very beginning of the 90s that there was a really seismic shift happening in the world, and it's a bit what Fernand Braudel describes, that in the long term there are these seismic shifts, and it was the moment where we needed to look at China very carefully. And so I spoke with Ho Han-ru quite early on, 92, 93, that we might want to do an exhibition, but not only about China, but about these incredible dynamics and energy which evolved in many other Asian cities in the 90s. If you think about Seoul, if you think about Tokyo, of course, if you think about also Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, to only mention a few examples. And obviously in China we have not only Beijing and Shanghai, but this incredible art scene in Guangzhou. A very polyphonic situation where in many Asian cities a great generation of artists had emerged in the 90s. And none of these artists at that time, now we are very used to have exhibition of these artists in European museums. There are group shows, there are biennales. At that time, really none of these artists had any exposure whatsoever in Western museums. The only ones who had some institutional exposure might have been Marie Komori. She was already well known at that time. and maybe 2 or 3 other artists. But all the other artists we saw didn't really have exposure. So we felt it would be important to do a big show, something which would have critical mass. And having grown up in Switzerland, I was obviously very familiar with the work of Harald Seemann, and with his landmark show, When Attitudes Became Form. And the interesting thing when you read about Harald Seemann and the Attitudes exhibition is that there wasn't a kind of a master plan, but he went to see Jan Dibetz in Amsterdam, at the time a young artist, and he was interested by these processes he saw. And he asked Jan Dibetz, are there any other people who work like you? And Jan Dibetz sent him to see Mario Merz and some arte povera artists in Italy who are all very young at that time, late 60s. And then they said there is Hans Hake in New York. So Harald would just follow this route, and little by little, not with an a priori master plan, but out of this dialogue develop, a major exhibition.
It was curating by fax machine
kind
at that
of
point.
Fax machine had arrived by then. It wasn't email, but fax. So in some kind of way, we used a lot of fax and asked artists by fax, who are other artists we should visit before our trip. And Cities on the Move was clearly a fax-induced exhibition,
And you went first to Guangzhou. The first question is, how much, is there a connection between the research that Rem Koolhaas was starting to do into the Pearl River Delta and then the interest that you and Ho Han-ru began to take in the Asian city? Was that actually a dialogue that was happening, or were these kind of two interests arrived at independently?
It was at the beginning, Rem Koolhaas was earlier, because before Cities on the Move he had already published, in SMXL and, some of his groundbreaking research, on China, and we were obviously reading his work, and we did not know him at the time. And then when we did Cities on the Move, it needed really an institution who gave us the possibility to do it. And that's the same like when you see now Tempo del Postino in Basel. That was another idea we had for 10 years, and it needed the Manchester International Festival and Art Basel and Biola and Foundation and the theater in Basel in order to produce this unrealized idea. And with our Asian exhibition, it was the same. We wanted to do this show on Asian art, and it was only around 95, 96 that the Secession had then contacted us for a birthday exhibition. And I then told Han-ru, I have this invitation for the Secession to do their 100-year exhibition in Vienna. Would that not be the right context for our vague idea of an Asian show? The Secession had always had a lot of exchange with Asia, because Japanism, there was a huge influence on Japanese art, on Klimt and Chile. And so it felt kind of interesting to do that in Vienna. So we then decided that it couldn't just be a geographic show. It needed to be something else. And we didn't want it to be a theme show which would illustrate, where we would say this theme is about X, and then all the artists would have to illustrate it. But we wanted to find on the territory what this show should be. So we then decided to do a very mega big research. I mean, both Han-ru and I have been to Asia a lot. He, being from China, living in Paris, went back to China many times every year, and was certainly the most informed person I know on the planet about Chinese art in China and abroad. And I started to go a lot at that time to Korea. I spent a lot of time in Japan, met in Korea and Japan very exciting artists. And then we decided with Ho Han-ru to pool our knowledge and to go to all these other places we had never been to. And that really was the first journey I then made to China, which was 96, 97, I think, where Ho Han-ru introduced me to all the artists. We went to Guangzhou, we went to Shanghai and Beijing for about a week. But it was part of a longer trip of almost a month, which went through all these cities. And at the end of that trip, particularly in China, it became really clear that it needed to have a link to the city, because the city was so much on everybody's mind, this incredible mutation of cities. And to answer your last question about Rem, we then thought we should invite Rem to this project. And we went to visit Rem in Rotterdam, and he was extremely busy on that day, as it often happens in an architecture office, and he didn't really have time to spend any minute with us. So we have come all the way to see you in Rotterdam to talk to you about the Cities on the Move project. And he then said, don't worry, I am tomorrow in Hong Kong. what he didn't think is that Hu Hanru really, and I really went to the travel agent and we bought a ticket and jumped on a plane and did go to Hong Kong and, showed up the next day in Hong Kong and said, hello, Rem, let's have dinner. And that was really the beginning of a friendship, which has lasted ever since. And, a daily, if not weekly, conversation with him. And his, involvement in Cities on the Move was very, very important. He advised us to meet a lot of architects, not only young ones, in Hong Kong, in mainland China and elsewhere, in Singapore, but also very interesting pioneers from the 60s and 70s. So we actually, more and more got aware that there are these very, very amazing avant-gardes of architecture, urbanism, art, in Asia in the 60s and 70s, which just weren't really known either in Europe at that time. And so that made the project transgenerational, like Tai Keng Soon or, also William Lim became then part of the project. And at the same time, Rem then got involved to design the Cities on the Move version at the Hayward, where he collaborated for the first time on an exhibition with Ole Sharon, and they then went on to build, CCTV, and the rest is kind of history.
Absolutely. And it was interesting because at that moment, when you were first starting to engage with the scene in China, it had yet to really emerge from underground. It was kind of still in this half underground situation where the important work was being shown in basements or in apartments, and not certainly in commercial galleries, of which there were maybe only one or two. So I'm curious sort of how one went about really navigating at that point, and where these kinds of meetings with artists would take place, and I don't know if there are any memorable moments in these initial meetings.
I mean, the interesting thing was that at that time, I mean, now to go to Beijing or Shanghai is almost like going to New York or London or Paris. You just visit all the galleries, and it's very easy to meet artists, and you can see a lot of things in 1 or 2 days, and there are existing art infrastructures, and that was absolutely not the case at that time. It was really we were advised not at all to let anybody official know that we would go there, so it happened very much, in the underground. We avoided to inform the embassies, and so that our trip wasn't an official one. Hu Hanru had informed most of the artists he knew in Guangzhou, in Shanghai, and in Beijing that we would arrive, and then it led to the situation that we would just go to the local art schools and to some artist-run spaces where 20, 30, 40 artists would wait for us, showing us dossiers. And it was very much, a kind of a rumor principle. There was a rumor we would come to town, and we met these artists, and it was somehow the beginning of a dialogue with most of them. But there was really not a lot of visible kind of infrastructures at that time. There were not many galleries. I mean, Lawrence Helbing had just opened his first gallery, Shang Art, in a hotel. So, it was a tiny little corner in a hotel in Shanghai where the whole, saga of Shang Art started. So it was really all about beginnings. And I suppose that also made it so incredibly exciting. And, that's why I do make the link to Harald Seeman's, When Attitudes Become Form, because I think to some extent it's very rare in a life of a curator that all these things come together. That you do a research, the timing is right. We couldn't have done this show 5 years earlier, and had we done it 3 years later, it would have been too late. So it had to happen exactly at that very moment in time. And there was this incredible Aufbruchstimmung. There was this feeling of a nation, of an emergent energy, which is not so different from when I spoke to Seeman, what he described to me in the 60s and 70s, in the West. And there were all these incredible artists, movements and groupings, because obviously a lot of these energies were self-organized, no? And we had in Guangzhou the Big Tail Elephant Group, and that happened again in apartments. So, many of the meetings we had with the artists sort of happened in apartments. And it was the beginning, Cities on the Move was really the beginning then of a very sustained series of research, because we decided also with Hu Hanru that it would be interesting to do a show, because we felt it's a bit superficial that we just do an Asian show and then move on, but that it could be interesting to really do a sustained, research, which is about sustainability and legacy. And so we developed the show as a touring show, and the idea was that it would go to 7, 8, 9 cities. And so, we continued for over 3 years to let it evolve, and we kept returning to China. And once Cities on the Move was over, I just continued to go to China all the time, and it was somehow, it has not stopped ever since.
Right. No, that was sort of the next phase, I guess, would have been after Cities on the Move, when things, for example, I think we first met at the Guangzhou Triennial in 2002, which was the first real moment you had state a state-sponsored museum doing, I mean, some would count the Ho Hanru's Shanghai Biennale in 2000, but really it was 2002 in Guangzhou that you had a full-on kind of embrace of experimental art practice by a state museum and a serious effort at kind of a retrospective. And I remember you coming for that conference, and then very shortly thereafter, you know, in the beginnings of this decade, after you had things like China shows, you know, shows of Chinese art happening in museums all over the world, you started to move more towards working with individual artists, or small groups of artists. So for example, there was this show in 2003 at the museum in Paris with Yang Ho Chang Camera, right? Yang Fudong and Wang Jianwei together, right? Was that, how did that come about?
Yeah, as you say, I mean, you know, it kind of became at a certain moment obvious that, I mean, Cities on the Move was a kind of a beginning, and none of these artists have had exhibitions, but then things developed with an incredible pace. I mean, first of all, Cities on the Move didn't stop touring, and every city wanted to have Cities on the Move. And we felt it's kind of interesting to use that interest, but not to do a packaged kind of China or Asia exhibition, but to really do a laboratory and each time produce new content. So we found each time we invited another architect to design the show. Chang Yung-ho did it for the Louisiana Museum in Denmark. Shigeru Ban did it for Kiasma in Helsinki. As I said, Raymond Ole for the Hayward. And somehow...
and Ole by himself in Bangkok then.
And
too,
then,
right?
oh, exactly, I forgot about that. Ole Sharon on his own, because the show ultimately went, you know, after a long, long Europe and United States tour, the show traveled also to Asia, which was very interesting, that the final destination was Asia, and where actually the show, Cities on the Move, which was always a performative idea of a city, it became a city, because the show dissolved in Bangkok. It happened in artist studios, in architectural labs, and you know, all of that. But by that time, there had been an incredible amount of other group shows happening. I mean, Harald Seemann had soon after Cities on the Move invited many Chinese artists to the Venice Biennale. What we both, you know, had in common is that we both lived in the, I mean, both Harald and Huan Ro and I, all the three of us, you know, lived in the embassy of Uli Sik in Beijing. And the role of Uli Sik was a very, very important one, because he was the Swiss ambassador, you know, one of the great decisions of Switzerland to have Uli Sik as an ambassador, you know, in China. If there would be in more countries such great ambassadors, you know, probably art history would have gone, you know, differently, because that really made a huge difference. Because Uli Sik, the whole embassy was full of artists and full of art, and to some extent, you know, he played a very important role. And so soon after Cities on the Move, I mean, Harald Seemann also came to the opening of Cities on the Move in Vienna, invited many artists to, you know, to Venice, and then it really started to explode, and these artists were invited in hundreds of group shows, you know, all over the world. And so at a certain moment, speaking to the artists, they kind of told me, and there's always, you know, conversation with artists is the core of all of these projects I do. They were saying, like, mainly Chinese artists were saying they're very alienated, because we're always invited to these group shows, and we're not invited as artists, but we're just invited as some kind of, you know, national token of some sorts, you know. So I felt it would be a good moment to switch it around and start to do, after having gone into the wider sense, to go more into depth, no? And so the idea was to do solo shows. Camera was the beginning of that. I was at the time curator at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, and we invited Yang Fudong, at that time, you know, not very well-known filmmaker and video artist from Shanghai, Wang Jianwei, a previous generation. He's 10 years older, 15 years older than Yang Fudong, video artist, filmmaker, also theater impresario and installation artist, a very transdisciplinary figure. We invited them to do 2 solo shows in the Musée d'Art Moderne. Now, we also invited Chang Yung-ho to develop an exhibition display, so he invented these cameras, spaces into which these artworks were then shown, and this exhibition toured to Romania, to Bucharest, where it marked the opening show of the Bucharest Museum in a very strange setup in Ceausescu's palace. It was an extremely strange situation. In any case, that then gave another, you know, necessity to even go more into depth with one artist, and I felt it would be really interesting to show everything Yang Fudong had done up to this point, because he just felt, you know, I felt each video was more amazing than the other one. So we decided to do a solo show in Miami. I was invited to curate a show for the Moore Space, which was a kind of a Kunsthal in Miami. It's now closed, but it was a very important Kunsthal for Miami in the early 2000s. And so we just filled that whole space. It was a Jim Lambie solo show and a Yang Fudong show with dozens and dozens of, you know, of his films. And obviously what happened with that, and many other curators started to do the same thing, to do solo shows, is that suddenly these artists started to be much more seen really as individual artists and no longer part of that sort of packaging situation. But I think it's still a long way to go. What is still missing, and that leads us to Phil and his great activity now as publisher, there is still missing a lot of books, because it's interesting. I mean, I've just written for Ai Weiwei's Faiden monograph and done another Ai Weiwei monograph with Elena Foster for Ivory Press. And these books have just come out in the last couple of weeks. So Ai Weiwei has now 2 monographs out. But many of the other Chinese artists of the 80s, of the 90s, they are still missing a really good book. So I think particularly in terms of publishing, there is an incredibly urgent gap still to fill.
A lot of the interviews in the book that we're about to launch were done in preparation for China Power Station, which was a show you did shortly after arriving at the Serpentine in 2006. What did it mean to sort of go back to this national show situation after having been kind of so far from it earlier on in your career? I mean, why was that the moment to again sort of reinvent the China show or reincarnate the China show?
Yeah, I mean, that has a lot to do with the the local context somehow of London. And Julia Peyton-Johns and I had started to collaborate in 2006, and I had moved to London as the co-director of the Serpentine Gallery. And so Julia and I thought, what could be urgent in London? What does London need? And in some kind of way, if by that time Paris, France and Italy and Switzerland, most parts of Europe had a lot of solo and group shows of Chinese artists, London had completely had nothing. I mean, there was just, with the exception of the Red Mansion Foundation, a very important initiative of Nicolette Kwok, who had systematically brought Chinese artists to the UK. There had just not been a major exhibition in a London institution. The V&A had done an interesting endeavor into photography,
sure.
But there was not a big survey show. So we felt that it's incredibly urgent to, and the same thing by the way was true in terms of Indian art, the Middle Eastern art, particularly paradoxical, looking at the history of the UK, it was just missing. So we felt, in some kind of way, it was very important once more, 10 years later, to introduce these artists to a place they had not been introduced yet at all. But we felt it's also important to do it in a space which is big enough to really show many of these amazing video and film works, which we wanted to show, and installation works, which may be too big to fit into a museum. And so that's why we then decided with Julia to explore the Battersea Power Station, which is a gigantic landmark in the middle of London, which was empty and abandoned for a long time, and installed this exhibition. And that was another reason to revisit China and do many trips to China and reinvigorate, and at the same time open up also to a new generation which somehow had entered for the first time, and also explore more projects with new media. I mean, one of the core projects of China Power Station was the blog of Ai Weiwei, which I consider to be one of the great social sculptures of the 21st century. I think the blog, if Joseph Beuys spoke about social sculpture, I think Ai Weiwei is the great social sculptor of our time, and his blog is read by millions and millions of people, or we must say was read by millions and millions of people, because it was actually a few days ago shut down by the government in China. And so, in some kind of way, China Power Station featured for the first time this major social sculpture of Ai Weiwei in the context of an exhibition. And obviously there had also been emerged a completely new generation of artists by that time who were not in Cities on the Move, like Sao Fei. We have Hu Fang here with us, which is wonderful, who has pioneered one of the key spaces in China of the 2000s, really injected a whole new energy through the vitamin space together with Zhang Wei. And we, collaborating with Hu Fang for many years, several of these younger artists have then entered China Power Station, artists who were 10 years younger, than the artists we had in Cities on the Move.
That's great. I guess one last question as we prepare to wrap up, which is just kind of what, you obviously interview people all over the world and in all sorts of different languages. Are there any kind of recurring misunderstandings or sort of difficulties in translation that have occurred kind of in this long conversation with China?
Misunderstandings. I mean, it's an interesting thing that in some kind of way, most of these interviews have actually been translated, but they've always been translated by friends. We've never really had translators, it's always been, I mean, Phil, you have done lots of translations in conversations we've done with artists. Hu Fang has very often helped me to do these conversations. So it's been very rarely, and they happen, they didn't really happen on stage until very recently. They happen mostly still in studios, and it's only very recently that we really put it in stage and made these interviews public in China. That was happened actually January the 1st this year, when with Hu Fang we had the feeling, and with Zhang Wei, that it would be interesting to do a post-Olympic marathon. This is the Olympic year had been gone, the Herzog de Meuron IBW Stadium had been built, the Olympic festivities were over, and we felt it was a good moment to assess at the beginning of 2009, what's the post-Olympic situation in China. So we did in the Vitamin Space for like 12 hours, a non-stop New Year celebration where I interviewed, in public, and that produced a whole other, range of interviews. But misunderstanding, I mean, the funniest thing was kind of that it took me a very long time to find out my nickname in Chinese, and why it was Little Hans. And basically, the reason for that nickname, Little Hans, was actually related to the fact that there was a big Hans who had arrived in China 10 years earlier than me, and about whom you, I actually think, know more than me, who was a very important pioneer for Ai Weiwei also, no?
No, he was a major, actually a young conceptual artist in Amsterdam who then sort of disappeared for 15 years and reappeared in China in the 80s, and then began the China Art Archives and Warehouse with Ai Weiwei, which was one of the first major spaces there. And so he kind of he passed away then in 2003, but he posthumously retains this title of Big Hans. So you are and forever will be in the Chinese mind, Little Hans. In any case, I think...
Anyway, I like the idea that we're talking here a book which isn't yet, and it's a bit like a book machine, because the book has been layouted literally an hour ago, and it should arrive on Phil's screen. I'm not wrong, right? Or maybe it won't. So you can imagine these designers now in Shenzhen. And then, another thing about China which is interesting, I mean, it's all about translation in both directions, because we also have Chevalier here, who has actually translated, she had translated most of my interviews for Modern Weekly, a magazine in China.
A very mass circulation.
Totally, millions of copies, and so that would be like as if in Time magazine or in Newsweek, my interviews which appear, which obviously they don't. And so, to some extent, it was really very interesting that all of a sudden my kind of conversation project in China reached, millions of people. So that's another kind of translation kind of situation, which was very interesting. And so the translation goes really now into both directions. I mean, the China interviews are translated into English and other languages, and all the interviews I kind of do globally are now translated into Chinese. So it's kind of ping and pong, one can say. And that obviously also ties in with something we, whilst the book arrives, we have more time to talk. There is one of the things, talking about reciprocity, after having, worked a lot with China and invited Chinese artists into Western institutions, I always felt it's very important to do this with co-curators, from the Chinese context. I never wanted to be in that kind of position of, having a Western view on China. I mean, that's really how the collaboration with Hu Hanru started, because I felt that ping pong most, fruitful, and so did he. That it was really, a view from him, being Chinese, and then from me being Swiss on China, and that sort of same happened when we did, do it with Hu Fang. Again, it was a ping pong, and we chose the artists, together. And at a certain moment, this sort of reciprocity of ping pongs led also to the fact that I would start to work in China. No, so I was invited. I mean, when Phil and I met, that was the first or the second Guangzhou, the first Guangzhou Triennale. And Hu Hanru and I were then invited to curate, was it the second?
The second, yeah.
Yeah, the second Guangzhou Triennale. So suddenly we found ourselves responsible for, this very, very big exhibition, and that became the first experience for me to, curate in China. And that has produced another big range of interviews, maybe a core really of interviews, which will be in Phil's book, which Phil edited. I mean, for example, which I consider to be one of the most, in some kind of maybe special conversations we will have in the book, is really the Elephant Group. It's the last time this group had completely gathered.
Exactly.
Before one of their members died, and they had also dissolved. And so, in some kind of way, that was something which just happened in a lunch break, in Guangzhou when we installed the Triennale. So we can say, these conversations they're very much production of reality conversation. They happen whilst we do exhibitions. They happen And they very often, out of them, grew new exhibitions, something like that, maybe.
That's great. Well, I think we may have to break the filibuster before the actual thing appears, but we will be distributing this book through all the major distributors. It's on the fall lists. It's in at $50, and it's a great introduction to these 26 artists and who together kind of form a whole constellation of the scene in China over the last 10 and 15 years. So thanks a lot, Hans-Ulrich, for taking time to have this conversation and to share with us this history.
It's perfect.